All right, hello everyone. Good morning. It's July 22nd. I have up on my screen the new moon in Leo that's going to be happening in a couple days from now. Um, it's an interesting new moon primarily for the reason that there are numerous aspects being made by this new moon. Um, Most obvious would be the opposition to Pluto and Aquarius, the and then the lesser aspects would be the trine to Saturn and Neptune here in Aries, the sextile to Gemini in Uranus, and also not quite a conjunction, but the fact that Mercury retrograde is happening in Leo with this new moon will put an emphasis on the Mercury retrograde dynamic. Um, so, because, and then I think it's also important to consider as well that um, this would be an aversion to Jupiter. So while there's a lot of aspects being made by the new moon, Jupiter in Cancer is in a kind of a blind spot to the new moon. And you could say the same about Mars right now. I just did a video recently, the other day, on Mars on the south node in a square to Venus. Um, Anyways, I'm going to run down a few of the different. I think mainly what's interesting is that the outer planet arrangement here, where you have sextiles happening between the modern outer planets, Neptune, Pluto, and Uranus, and that pattern of unfolding sextiles is just being continued with this new moon in Leo, setting off this kind of resonant sweep of the kind of a basket kind of bowl formation, um, and I will kind of run down some of the dynamics here. Of course, I think one topic that should be on everybody's mind, or if it's not on your mind, maybe you have some things to reflect on, is the topic of fascism, authoritarianism, totalitarianism, censorship, oppression, repression, um, and vast differentiate differentials. Sorry, excuse me. The power differential, the power imbalance, right? The modes of coercive control and manipulation and abuse and whatnot that would be indicative of a cult dynamic, perhaps. Because I think that something about Aquarius and it's the need for structure and discipline and all this kind of stuff. What's interesting is I've recently, um, I don't watch it all the time. But I've found somebody on YouTube, a woman named the Knitting Cult Lady, who talks about cult dynamics and stuff like that. And one of the things that's interesting about her is that she also has experience with the military. And there's something about the problem about cults is not just that, like, the actual cults themselves, but all these larger structures and organizations. And what I'm trying to get at here is that she talks about the appeal of the military being like the military gives you a very clearly defined hierarchy where everybody has their rank and role and position. Everybody fits into this clearly defined position and has their job and has their thing that they do and answers. And that for some certain personality type, there's an appeal to this, but there's an inner kind of cultiness around that. And then I also think that there's also, like, to give a different example that's not really so much with that, is that even things like these kind of like business entrepreneur, like you're gonna get motivational seminars, like you get a bunch of people get all motivated to, like, we're gonna self-actualize and realize our dreams and all, but in order to do that we'll train you how to be good business people, right? And it's like there's these similar kinds of, like, coercive control dynamics and these like large group awareness training kind of things. I think all this kind of stuff is very, because you've got this direct opposition to Pluto. These themes are all very resonant and relevant right now. And then similarly with that, you've got the ruler of Aquarius is Saturn, and it's in this conjunction with Neptune, which doubles up that kind of dynamic. And there's certain issues around, I think you might be seeing things like skepticism around things which may be woo-woo and paranormal. I mean, this does, unfortunately, I think this one is not very helpful right now from my position of being somebody who likes doing astrology and is basically inclined to continue doing astrology. And I just have I don't know why, it's hard to explain. I was thinking about, this is one thing that I've been considering whether or not to do a larger video on this based on the Saturn Neptune dynamic, but there's this whole kind of interest that I have in new agey stuff that I have to admit that I there are other astrologers who I follow who have been more explicitly into things like tarot and astrology and all this kind of stuff from a young age. And I have to admit that it's something that I had to develop over time. But even when I was fairly young, like let's say in my early 20s or so, I would still be curiously poking my head into the new age metaphysical bookstore and trying to look for certain, I've always had the curiosity, right? But there's something about, I think I've always also understood that there either must be a certain bullshit factor involved, or that there's something about it which is always disappointing, right? Or that, I think that there's something about, if you're playing off this thing I was talking about earlier about cult dynamics, is that there's a certain sense of dissatisfaction, or people who are unhappy with their lives, who are looking for some kind of escape, and are seeking, or this could, Saturn Neptune dynamic could also be seen in things to do with fantasy and imagination and stuff like that, or the limitations of imagination. And there's this kind of there's something about the I'll give you an example. I was listening the other day, people talking about this is something that's really my cup of tea, but I'm just out of curiosity, I was listening to people talk about this reality shifting thing, and more in specifically, there is a certain kind of fandom reality shifting, which to me, from my perspective, listening to this as an outsider, it sounds like people who have created a certain, imagine if you were really into a certain fictional universe, and you have, prior to this idea of you are going to somehow, it's not as similar, it sounds like it's similar to astral traveling or lucid dreaming or something like that, but you want to live inside of a dream world alternate reality where you are in your fantasy universe. In some way, I think when people read books, this is kind of what you would do anyways, because to read a book requires you to produce a fantasy image of what is happening in the book, to create this mental world, but you're doing it with the guidance of the, obviously the author telling you what it is, there's a shared imaginary experience between the creator and you, the person who is bringing it to life by reading it, or whatever, right? There's something about, you're probably not going to try to create your imaginary fantasy world or whatever if you haven't already invested a whole bunch of time in reading the books or watching the movies or this kind of stuff. And so essentially what it sounds like to me is that people have already invested a lot of time into a certain virtual space or imaginary space, and now people are somehow, as maybe perhaps an unhealthy coping mechanism or something like that, kind of running off into a kind of daydream la land of this fantasy reality so they don't have to deal with real life, right? And there's something about that, the inclination, regardless of judging that as being wrong or something like that, you can notice that there's this inclination to do that also shows up in people who are funny UFO cultists, or like the aliens are going to, like the rapture, like everything is going to end and it's going to change and we're going to be released from this boring life we don't like, and the aliens are going to take us to some great, or we're going to go through a big transformation, and all these secrets are going to be revealed, and we're going to live in a new future society of full of hope. And there's something about this which is like the wish fulfillment fantasy that's not that different of like living inside your own virtual fan fiction where you get to play a better part rather than dealing with the parts of life that you don't like, right? And so I think there's a sort of escapist fantasy to all this that is perhaps. But then what's funny about this is there's always the obvious disappointing thing, which is that even if these people allow themselves to delude themselves, from the outside position, it could be clearly obvious where these things fall short, or that these people are, if you don't want, like, if you're the character you play in this agreed upon RPG game we called life, and you have to define yourself, your character stats, by these certain attributes and stuff like that, and you just don't like this game and you want to invent a different character for yourself and live in like a live action role play La La Land. At some point in time, I think the cracks in this structure begin to show, and the imperfection of the light shines in through the imperfection, that it's not the thing you're trying to erect is not quite doing it for you, right? And so there's some kind of from that, perhaps I think maybe Uranus and Gemini could maybe influence this kind of dynamic, which I'm referring to with this essay from F. Scott Fitzgerald, Fitzy, the Crackup, right? That there's the Uranus is often a disruptive influence. It's like there's some kind of breakthrough, or there's some kind of tension between two opposing forces, are increasingly opposed and divided society. Under more pressure is just like the cracks begin to expand, the divisions begin to further fragment, and eventually the breakthrough happens one way or another, right? And I think this is basically what we're working with now, is that there's some, if you can see in the new moon in Leo with Mercury retrograde in Aquarius, I don't know. Leo for me is one of these signs where I don't want to be entirely, categorizing Leos in a certain way based on negative experiences of Leos, and then discriminating against a whole group of people based on something as arbitrary as what time of year they were born. But I notice sometimes that Leos tend to like congregate together in groups, or and it's kind of arguable what's worse, a group of Leos or just one narcissistic Leo on his own. But there's some I don't know, maybe I'm just jealous. I think there is, on the upside, I think there's something about Leo being the sign of people who are born in the summer that perhaps lends itself to a kind of summer fun mentality. But in the fact that the problem about this is that when this kind of summer fun kind of, put on the flip-flops and the board shorts and like crack a few cold ones, it's a Leo party. You've got a Mercury retrograde here. And so perhaps if you just taking it easy and relaxing, that might be better than trying to do serious things when this Mercury retrograde is going on. It is in this trine, though. The whole thing is in this trine to Saturn and Neptune. And this is practical, mundane. You know what? I'm thinking I do a lot of stuff where I'm waxing philosophical. And I've seen that, aside from the mundane astrology of talking about current events and news and politics, there's some maybe I'm getting too much in the philosophical, the heady stuff, and or talking about weird cult dynamics. And there's some very practical things which should be taken into consideration here. Number one, um, if I were to plan something like a boating trip, if I was going to be like planning, like I was going to get boats and yachts, and I wouldn't do it right now with a Saturn Neptune, because one of the things is that Saturn and Neptune, I think even without it being in Pisces, the Neptune and brings this thing about water, and Saturn brings this thing about blind ignorance or stupidity or problems. And there's some sort of Mercury retrograde. There's something about, like, I would personally, I live near the water. I very rarely actually go on boats or go swimming or something like that. And maybe I have a paranoid fear of the water, but I personally, if I were you, I would stay away from yacht parties, boat trips, getaways to little remote islands, that kind of stuff. I would just kind of avoid that right now. And what else is there? There's also this kind of question around coercion, control, censorship, that kind of stuff, or power dynamics, right? Like, if you do take the bait, if you do get on the yacht, what happens when you're out in the remote waters in the middle of nowhere and you're just at the mercy of these like crazy yacht guys, right? Like, that's kind of the problem, right? Or else with Uranus and Gemini, there's some pressure to do something new, something different, to switch it up perhaps with the Uranus and a new sign. But I think it's still too early right now to really tell what that's going to look like. And another thing to consider is that the Saturn and Neptune thing is all going to retrograde back into Pisces eventually. Although that's not going to be for a while. Since we're just doing a new moon Leo video, I'm not going to get into this right now. We don't have to worry about Saturn in Pisces quite yet. But we're going to have, eventually we're going to have this full moon in Aquarius with Pluto. And so, you may have seen some of these themes in the news to do with various corruption of people in government and power and sort of tightly controlled, maybe agencies or the structures of, I think information control or technological control or all that kind of stuff. So this is a great one to like put on the tinfoil hat, I would say, like, take it, like, there's a certain kind of summer fun thing, and you could maybe spend some time, having a fun summer cookout, talking about conspiracy theories. But my advice is avoid the water sports and avoid, I don't know. There's also the whole thing about air travel, with Uranus. I think air travel is more of a Uranus thing, and water travel is more of a Saturn Neptune thing. Eventually we're going to have, whatever. We'll do all this later. This should be good enough for now. Thank you for watching. Tune in for next time.